Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell never imagined that a routine reconnaissance mission would change her life forever. The 26-year-old intelligence officer had been stationed in Afghanistan for 8 months, working behind the scenes to gather crucial information about enemy movements. She was known among her unit as the quiet one who always got the job done without making a fuss. On a cold morning in March, Sarah received orders that made her stomach turn. She was to accompany a small team deep into Taliban territory to photograph a suspected weapons cache. The mission was supposed to last 3 days, but everyone knew that things rarely went according to plan in the mountains of Afghanistan. Sarah packed her gear carefully that night. She folded her extra uniform, checked her camera equipment twice, and wrote a letter to her younger brother back in Ohio. She didn't mail it, though. Something felt different about this mission, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she might not come back. The team consisted of 5 soldiers, including Sarah. There was Sergeant Rodriguez, a tough guy from Texas who had been in the Army for 12 years. Private Johnson was barely 19 and still got nervous before every mission. Corporal Williams had a wife and 2 kids back home and always carried their photos in his chest pocket. Finally, there was Captain Brooks, their leader who had earned respect through 3 deployments. They left the base at dawn, driving in 2 armored vehicles toward the mountains. The landscape was beautiful but dangerous, with rocky peaks that seemed to touch the sky and valleys where enemies could hide easily. Sarah sat in the back of the second vehicle, watching the scenery change from desert to mountain terrain. After 6 hours of driving, they reached a small village where they planned to spend the night. The villagers were friendly, but cautious. Sarah noticed how the children stayed close to their mothers and how the men watched their every move. She had learned enough of the local language to understand basic conversations, and she could hear people whispering about soldiers in the area. That evening, while the team set up camp in an abandoned building, Sarah reviewed their route on the map. Tomorrow they would climb higher into the mountains, leaving their vehicles behind. The weapons cache was supposedly hidden in a cave system that could only be reached on foot. The intelligence report suggested it would be lightly guarded, but Sarah had learned not to trust reports completely. As darkness fell, the team took turns keeping watch. Sarah volunteered for the midnight shift, preferring to stay alert when others were sleeping. She sat by a small window, looking out at the star-filled sky and thinking about home. Her brother was probably playing basketball with his friends, completely unaware of where she was or what dangers she faced. Around 2 in the morning, Sarah heard something that made her freeze. It was the sound of footsteps on gravel. Too many footsteps for a single person. She woke Captain Brooks quietly, and they both listened. The sounds were getting closer, and they definitely weren't coming from wild animals. Brooks made a quick decision. They needed to leave immediately, even in the darkness. The team packed their gear in minutes, moving like ghosts through the building. They slipped out through a back window and made their way to a rocky hillside behind the village. From their hiding spot, they watched as armed men searched the building they had just left. Sarah counted at least 8 fighters with automatic weapons. Her heart pounded as she realized how close they had come to being caught while they slept. The team waited until the searchers left, then began moving through the mountains in darkness. They used night vision goggles and followed animal paths that were barely visible. Every step was dangerous, as loose rocks could cause noise or send someone tumbling down the steep slopes. By morning, they were exhausted, but alive. They found shelter in a small cave and decided to rest until evening before continuing their mission. Sarah tried to sleep, but her mind kept racing. She couldn't stop thinking about those armed men and how they had known exactly where to look for the American soldiers. Captain Brooks pulled her aside during the afternoon. He explained that their mission had been compromised, but they were too far from base to turn back safely. They would have to complete their objective and hope for the best. Sarah nodded, understanding that their survival now depended on staying ahead of whoever was hunting them. As the sun began to set on their second day, the team prepared to move deeper into enemy territory. Sarah checked her equipment one more time and looked at her teammates. These 4 men had become like brothers to her over the past months. She couldn't imagine facing the dangers ahead without them. What none of them knew was that their every move was being tracked by a network of local informants. The Taliban had been expecting them for days, and the trap was already set. Sarah's instincts had been right to worry about this mission, but it was too late to turn back now. The third day started with an ominous silence that made Sarah's skin crawl. The mountains around them seemed too quiet, with no bird songs or animal sounds that usually filled the morning air. The team moved carefully along a narrow ridge, staying low to avoid being seen from the valley below. Captain Brooks led the way, studying his GPS device and comparing it to the hand-drawn map they had received from intelligence. According to their information, the weapons cache was hidden in a cave system about 2 miles ahead. The path would take them through a narrow canyon that offered good cover but also created a perfect place for an ambush. Sarah walked third in line, behind Sergeant Rodriguez. She kept looking over her shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that they were being watched. Her training had taught her to trust her instincts, and right now every instinct was screaming danger. Around noon, they reached the entrance to the canyon. The walls rose steeply on both sides, creating deep shadows even in the bright sunlight. Captain Brooks called for a 5-minute rest while he scouted ahead. The team crouched behind large boulders, drinking water and checking their weapons. Private. Johnson whispered to Sarah that he had seen movement on the ridge above them. When she looked up, she saw nothing but rocks and scrubby vegetation. However, she noticed that some of the shadows seemed wrong, as if they were hiding shapes that didn't belong in the natural landscape. Brooks returned from his scouting trip with concerning news. The canyon floor was covered with loose rocks that would make noise with every step. Worse, there were only 2 ways out, the way they came in and a narrow exit at the far end that was over a mile away. If enemies blocked either end, they would be trapped. Despite the risks, the mission had to continue. The intelligence about the weapons cache was too important to ignore. These weapons could be used against American forces or Afghan civilians. Sarah understood the stakes, but she also understood that they might not survive to deliver the information. The team entered the canyon in single file, moving as quietly as possible. Sarah found herself holding her breath, listening for any sound that might indicate trouble. The only noise was their own careful footsteps and the occasional small rock falling from the canyon walls. They had walked about half a mile when Corporal Williams suddenly stopped and raised his fist, the signal for everyone to freeze. He pointed to the canyon wall on their left, where Sarah could now see what had caught his attention. There were fresh scratches in the rock, the kind made by metal equipment being dragged across stone. Captain Brooks examined the marks and confirmed their worst fears. A heavy machine gun had been positioned there recently, probably within the last day or 2. Someone had known they were coming and had prepared for their arrival. The mission was definitely compromised, but they were already deep in the canyon. With no easy way to retreat, the team pressed forward, weapons ready and nerves on edge. Sarah's mouth was dry despite the water she had been drinking. She tried to focus on her breathing and stay calm, knowing that panic could get them all killed. When the attack came, it was swift and devastating. The first shots echoed off the canyon walls like thunder, making it impossible to tell exactly where they originated. Sarah dove behind a boulder as bullets sparked off the rocks around her. She could hear her teammates shouting to each other, but the echoes made their voices confusing. Sergeant Rodriguez was the first to be hit. Sarah saw him spin and fall, clutching his shoulder. Blood was already soaking through his uniform. Private. Johnson tried to reach him but was pinned down by gunfire from above. The enemy had positioned themselves on both sides of the canyon, creating a deadly crossfire. Captain Brooks was yelling orders, but Sarah could barely hear him over the sound of automatic weapons. She could see muzzle flashes from at least 6 different positions on the canyon walls. They were completely surrounded and outnumbered by at least 3 to 1. Sarah returned fire with her rifle, aiming at the muzzle flashes above. She had always been a good shot, and she could see dust and rock chips flying where her bullets hit. But for every shot she fired, dozens came back at her position. The battle lasted only 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. When the shooting finally stopped, Sarah found herself alone behind her boulder, ears ringing from the gunfire. She called out to her teammates but got no response. The silence was more terrifying than the gunfire had been. Carefully, Sarah looked around the edge of her cover. What she saw made her stomach turn. Captain Brooks was lying motionless 20 feet away, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. Corporal Williams was slumped against a rock, his eyes staring at nothing. She couldn't see Private Johnson or Sergeant Rodriguez from her position. Enemy voices were now echoing through the canyon, speaking in the local language. Sarah's limited vocabulary was enough to understand that they were searching for survivors. She heard footsteps moving between the rocks and realized that fighters were coming down from the canyon walls to check the bodies. Sarah made a desperate decision. She couldn't help her fallen teammates, but she might be able to escape if she acted quickly. She gathered her essential gear, water, ammunition, first aid kit, and her camera with the mission photos, and began crawling toward a crack in the canyon wall she had noticed earlier. The crack was barely wide enough for a person, but it offered the only possible escape route. Sarah squeezed through the opening just as she heard voices getting closer to her previous hiding spot. She was now in a narrow crevice that seemed to lead upward toward the canyon rim. As she climbed through the darkness, Sarah could hear the enemy fighters below discussing their successful ambush. They were laughing and congratulating each other on killing the American soldiers. The sound made her both angry and terrified, but she forced herself to keep climbing. After what felt like forever, Sarah emerged from the crevice onto a rocky ledge near the top of the canyon. She was bruised, exhausted, and emotionally shattered, but she was alive. However, her ordeal was just beginning. She was now alone in enemy territory, miles from safety, with limited supplies and no way to call for help. Sarah crouched on the rocky ledge, trying to control her shaking hands as the reality of her situation sank in. Her 4 teammates were dead, and she was completely alone in Taliban-controlled territory. The radio had been destroyed in the ambush, so she had no way to contact her base for rescue. The nearest friendly forces were over 50 miles away through some of the most dangerous terrain in Afghanistan. She took inventory of her supplies with a sinking heart. She had 2 bottles of water, enough for maybe 2 days if she was careful. Her food consisted of 3 energy bars and a small bag of nuts. Her ammunition was limited to what she carried in her vest, about 60 rounds for her rifle and 2 clips for her sidearm. Most importantly, she still had her camera with photos of several weapons storage sites they had discovered before the ambush. The sun was getting low in the sky, and Sarah knew she needed to find shelter before darkness fell. She could still hear voices from the canyon below as enemy fighters searched through her teammates' equipment. The sounds made her feel sick, but she forced herself to focus on survival. Sarah studied the terrain around her, using skills she had learned during survival training. The mountains stretched endlessly in all directions, covered with loose rock and sparse vegetation. She identified several possible routes, but all of them led through areas where she would be exposed to view from long distances. As night approached, Sarah found a small cave hidden behind some boulders. It was barely large enough for one person, but it offered protection from the cold mountain air and concealment from anyone searching for survivors. She crawled inside and tried to make herself comfortable on the hard stone floor. Sleep was impossible. Every sound made her jump. The wind through the rocks, small animals moving in the darkness, distant voices that might be real or imagined. Sarah had never felt so alone in her entire life. She thought about her brother back home, wondering if he would ever know what happened to her. When dawn broke, Sarah was exhausted but determined to start moving toward friendly territory. She had studied maps of the region during her training and knew the general direction she needed to travel. The journey would take her through 3 mountain ranges and several valleys controlled by enemy forces. Sarah began walking before the sun was fully up, staying close to rock formations that would hide her silhouette. She moved slowly and carefully, stopping frequently to listen and watch for signs of danger. Her military training had taught her to travel in a zigzag pattern to avoid creating an obvious trail. By mid-morning, she encountered her first major obstacle. A wide valley stretched before her, with a small village visible in the center. Smoke was rising from cooking fires, and she could see people moving between the buildings. There was no way to go around the valley without adding days to her journey, but crossing it meant risking exposure. Sarah spent 2 hours watching the village through her rifle scope. She identified the daily patterns of the residents, when they worked in their fields, when children played outside, when the men gathered to talk. She noticed that there were more military-age men in the village than seemed normal, suggesting that fighters might be using it as a base. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah realized she had no choice but to wait until dark and try to sneak around the edge of the village. She found a hiding spot among some large rocks and tried to rest while keeping watch. The waiting was almost unbearable, but she knew that patience could mean the difference between life and death. Around sunset, something happened that changed everything. A group of armed men emerged from the village and began climbing toward her position. They moved with purpose, as if they knew exactly where to look. Sarah's blood turned cold as she realized that someone must have seen her during the day. She had maybe 10 minutes before they reached her hiding spot. Sarah made a desperate decision to run rather than fight. She grabbed her gear and began moving quickly along the ridge, trying to put distance between herself and her pursuers. Behind her, she could hear shouting as the men discovered her abandoned position. The chase lasted for hours through the darkness. Sarah used every trick she had learned about moving quietly and avoiding detection, but the enemy fighters knew the terrain much better than she did. They seemed to anticipate her moves and kept cutting off her escape routes. Finally, around midnight, Sarah found herself trapped on a narrow ledge with nowhere to run. Below her was a sheer drop of at least 100 feet. Above her, the rock face was too steep to climb. She could hear her pursuers getting closer, their flashlight beams dancing across the rocks around her. Sarah made what she thought might be her final decision. Rather than be captured alive, she would fight until the end. She had heard stories about what happened to female soldiers taken prisoner by the Taliban, and death seemed preferable to that fate. She positioned herself behind the largest rock. She could find and waited for the enemy to come into view. Her hands were steady now and her mind was clear. She thought about her teammates who had died in the canyon and promised herself that she would make their sacrifice count for something. The first fighter appeared around a bend in the trail about 30 yards away. Sarah held her fire, knowing she would only get one chance to surprise them. She waited until she could see 3 men clearly, then opened fire with controlled, precise shots. The gunfight was brief, but intense. Sarah's first shots found their targets, dropping 2 of the fighters immediately. The third man took cover and began returning fire, his bullets sparking off the rocks around her position. Sarah could hear more voices approaching from behind him. Then something unexpected happened. The fighter stopped shooting and began calling out to her in broken English. He was offering her a chance to surrender, promising that she wouldn't be harmed if she gave up peacefully. Sarah almost laughed at the absurdity of trusting such a promise. Instead of answering, Sarah used the momentary pause to move to a better position. She had spotted a crack in the rock face that might lead to another escape route. It was dangerous, and probably impossible to climb in the dark, but it was better than staying trapped on the ledge. As she began moving toward the crack, Sarah heard an explosion from the direction of the village below. Orange flames lit up the night sky, followed by the sound of automatic weapons fire. Someone was attacking the village, and it wasn't her. The enemy fighters on the trail began shouting to each other in confusion. Sarah realized that this unexpected battle might be her chance to escape. She crawled toward the crack in the rock face, hoping that the distraction below would keep her pursuers busy long enough for her to find a way out of the trap. The explosion in the village below had created exactly the distraction Sarah needed. The enemy fighters who had been pursuing her were now torn between capturing her and defending their base. As gunfire erupted in the valley, Sarah squeezed through the crack in the rock face and found herself in a narrow passage that led deeper into the mountain. The passage was completely dark and barely wide enough for her body. Sarah had to feel her way forward with her hands, testing each step carefully to avoid falling into unseen holes. The rock walls were wet with condensation, making everything slippery and treacherous. She could hear water dripping somewhere in the darkness ahead. After crawling for what felt like hours, Sarah emerged from the passage onto a small plateau on the opposite side of the mountain from the village. The battle below was still raging, with muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness. Like deadly fireworks, she had no idea who was attacking the village, but she was grateful for whatever had drawn attention away from her. Sarah's relief was short-lived as she realized her situation had become even more desperate. The climb through the rock passage had torn her uniform and scraped her hands and knees raw. Worse, she had lost one of her water bottles when her backpack caught on a sharp edge in the narrow tunnel. She was now down to a single bottle of water in terrain where dehydration could kill her within days. The sun was beginning to rise, revealing the harsh landscape around her. Sarah was now on the far side of a mountain range she didn't recognize from any of the maps she had studied. The terrain looked even more barren and hostile than where she had started. In the distance, she could see smoke rising from several locations, suggesting that the fighting was spreading beyond the single village. Sarah forced herself to eat one of her precious energy bars and take small sips of water while she planned her next move. She estimated that she had traveled about 8 miles from the ambush site, but in the wrong direction. The detour meant she was now farther from friendly forces than when she had started. Using the sun to determine direction, Sarah began walking east toward what she hoped would eventually lead to Afghan government-controlled territory. The walking was brutal. The rocky ground was littered with loose stones that rolled under her feet, threatening to twist her ankles or send her tumbling down steep slopes. By midday, the mountain sun was blazing down on her with punishing intensity. Sarah's dark uniform absorbed the heat, making her feel like she was being cooked alive. She had to stop frequently to rest in whatever shade she could find behind boulders or in narrow crevices between rocks. As she crested a ridge in the early afternoon, Sarah saw something that made her heart race with both hope and terror. A road wound through the valley below, and she could see vehicles moving along it. The vehicles looked like military trucks, but she couldn't tell from this distance whether they belonged to friendly forces or enemies. Sarah spent an hour watching the road through her rifle scope. She counted 12 vehicles in a convoy, all painted in desert camouflage colors. The trucks were too far away to see markings clearly, but their spacing and formation suggested they were following military protocols rather than moving like civilian traffic. The decision of whether to try to signal the convoy was agonizing. If these were American or Afghan government forces, they represented her best chance of rescue. But if they belonged to Taliban or other hostile groups, revealing herself would mean certain death or capture. As Sarah watched, one of the trucks broke down and stopped by the side of the road. She observed how the other vehicles responded to this emergency. The convoy halted immediately, and soldiers deployed in defensive positions while others worked to fix the broken truck. Their actions looked professional and disciplined, more like regular army than militia fighters. Sarah made her decision. She began moving down the mountainside toward the road, but she planned her approach carefully. She would get close enough to observe the soldiers clearly before revealing herself. If they showed any signs of being hostile forces, she would retreat back into the mountains. The descent was treacherous. The slope was steep and covered with loose rocks that constantly threatened to start landslides. Sarah fell twice, scraping her already injured hands and jarring her knees painfully against sharp stones. By the time she reached the valley floor, her uniform was torn in several new places and she was bleeding from multiple cuts. Sarah positioned herself behind a large boulder about 200 yards from the road and studied the soldiers around the broken truck. Through her scope, she could finally make out details that made her heart jump with hope. The soldiers were wearing American military uniforms and carrying M4 rifles standard to U.S. forces. But Sarah's training had taught her to be suspicious of everything in enemy territory. Taliban fighters had been known to use captured American equipment and uniforms to set traps for unwary soldiers. She needed to be absolutely certain before revealing herself. Sarah watched for 30 minutes, looking for details that would confirm these were genuine American forces. She observed their radio procedures, their weapons handling, and their body language. Everything looked authentic, but she still hesitated to make contact. The decision was made for her when one of the soldiers walked directly toward her hiding spot. Sarah realized that despite her careful approach, she had been spotted by someone with trained eyes. She had seconds to decide whether to run, hide, or surrender. Sarah made a choice that went against all her survival instincts. She slowly stood up from behind the boulder with her hands raised, her rifle slung across her back in a non-threatening position. She called out in English, identifying herself by name, rank, and unit number. The approaching soldier immediately raised his weapon, shouting for her to get on the ground. Other soldiers were running toward her position, surrounding her with weapons drawn. Sarah complied with all their commands, lying face down on the rocky ground with her arms spread wide. What happened next was both the most frightening and most hopeful moment of her ordeal. The soldiers were following proper procedures for dealing with unknown contacts in hostile territory, which meant they were probably genuine American forces. But those same procedures meant they had to treat her as a potential threat until they could verify her identity. Sarah found herself zip-tied and blindfolded, loaded into the back of one of the trucks while soldiers radioed her information back to their command post. She understood why they had to be cautious, but after days of terror and isolation, being restrained by her own countrymen felt like a cruel twist. The truck ride lasted about an hour over rough roads that jarred Sarah's already battered body. She could hear radio chatter around her as the soldiers communicated with their base about the unexpected contact they had made. The conversations were professional but tense, suggesting that her appearance had created complications for whatever mission they were conducting. When the truck finally stopped, Sarah was helped out and led into what felt like a building. The blindfold was removed and she found herself in a small room facing a captain she didn't recognize. The man's expression was serious but not unfriendly as he began asking questions about her identity and how she had come to be alone in the mountains. Captain Martinez looked at Sarah with a mixture of concern and suspicion as she sat across from him in the small interrogation room. Her torn uniform, numerous cuts and bruises, and obvious exhaustion told a story of survival, but he had to verify every detail before he could trust her completely. In this part of Afghanistan, deception could be deadly for everyone involved. Sarah understood the captain's caution as she began recounting her story. She started with the original mission briefing, described each member of her team, and provided details about their route into the mountains. Her voice remained steady despite the emotional pain of talking about her fallen teammates, but her hands shook slightly when she reached the part about the ambush. Captain Martinez took notes while asking specific questions that only a genuine American intelligence officer would know how to answer. He asked about procedures, code words, and details about her base that weren't written in any manual. Sarah answered each question correctly, gradually earning more trust from her interrogator. The right breakthrough came when Sarah mentioned the photos she had taken before the ambush. She carefully removed her camera from her damaged backpack and showed Captain Martinez the images of weapons caches and enemy positions. The intelligence was exactly what his unit had been looking for, and it proved that her story was genuine. Captain Martinez stepped out of the room for a private radio conversation with his command. When he returned, his demeanor had changed completely. He ordered her restraints removed and offered her food, water, and medical attention. Sarah nearly cried with relief as she realized that her ordeal as a hunted fugitive was finally over. Medic treated Sarah's cuts and bruises while she ate her first real meal in 4 days. The simple military rations tasted better than any fancy restaurant food she had ever eaten. Captain Martinez explained that she was now at a forward operating base about 40 miles from her original unit's location. However, Sarah's relief was tempered by the captain's next words. The area between their current position and her home base was currently experiencing heavy fighting. Several Taliban groups had launched coordinated attacks across the region, making travel extremely dangerous for any military convoy. Sarah would have to wait until the situation stabilized before they could arrange safe transport. Sarah was assigned to a small sleeping area and given clean clothes to replace her torn uniform. For the first time in days, she felt truly safe as she lay down on a real cot with a roof over her head. But sleep brought nightmares about the ambush and her fallen teammates. She woke up several times during the night, thinking she heard gunfire that turned out to be just the wind. The next morning brought disturbing news. Radio intercepts had revealed that Taliban forces were actively searching for the missing American intelligence officer. They had found the bodies of Sarah's teammates and realized that one person had escaped. Enemy fighters were offering rewards to local villagers for any information about her whereabouts. Captain Martinez called Sarah to a planning meeting where she learned the full extent of the tactical situation. The Taliban offensive had cut off several American and Afghan government positions. Her forward operating base was now surrounded by hostile territory, with enemy forces controlling all the major roads and many mountain passes. Sarah's heart sank as she realized that her rescue might be weeks or even months away. The base had enough supplies for an extended siege, but every day they remained isolated, increased the chances of being overrun by superior numbers of enemy fighters. She had survived her solo escape only to become trapped again in a different kind of dangerous situation. During her second day at the base, Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She volunteered to join the base's defensive operations rather than waiting passively for rescue. Her intelligence training and fresh knowledge of enemy positions in the region made her valuable to the defense planning team. Captain Martinez was initially reluctant to put a traumatized soldier back into combat so soon after her ordeal, but Sarah insisted that staying active would help her deal with the emotional aftermath of losing her teammates. She also pointed out that her recent intelligence gathering made her one of the most knowledgeable people about current enemy movements in the area. Sarah threw herself into the work with determination that impressed the other soldiers at the base. She helped analyze radio intercepts, plan patrol routes, and prepare defensive positions. Her detailed knowledge of terrain features and enemy tactics proved invaluable for anticipating Taliban movements around the base perimeter. 3 days later, Sarah's expertise was put to the ultimate test. She was monitoring enemy radio communications when she detected signs of an impending attack on the base. The Taliban were planning a coordinated assault from 3 directions, designed to overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers and surprise. Sarah worked through the night with Captain Martinez and his staff to prepare countermeasures. They repositioned defensive weapons, established crossfire zones, and planned escape routes in case the base became untenable. Sarah's survival experience had given her insights into Taliban tactics that proved crucial for the defensive planning. The attack came just before dawn, exactly as Sarah had predicted. Enemy fighters approached from the north, east, and south simultaneously, firing rocket-propelled grenades and automatic weapons. The base defenders were ready for them, having prepared overlapping fields of fire that caught the attackers in deadly crossfires. Sarah found herself manning a radio position during the battle, coordinating defensive fire and calling in air support when it became available. Her calm voice guided friendly aircraft to target enemy positions she had identified through her analysis of their attack patterns. The combination of ground defense and airstrikes broke the Taliban assault within 2 hours. After the failed attack, enemy radio chatter revealed frustration and confusion among Taliban commanders. They had expected to surprise and quickly overwhelm the small base, but instead had suffered heavy casualties while inflicting minimal damage on the defenders. Sarah's intelligence work had turned what should have been a massacre into a decisive victory. The successful defense of the base created new opportunities for Sarah's rescue. The Taliban forces in the region had been significantly weakened by their failed assault, opening gaps in their control of transportation routes. More importantly, the base had proven its ability to survive and fight back, making it a priority for resupply and reinforcement missions. Captain Martinez informed Sarah that a rescue helicopter would attempt to reach them within the next 48 hours. The flight would be dangerous, requiring the aircraft to fly low through mountain valleys while avoiding enemy surface-to-air missiles. But for the first time since the ambush, Sarah had realistic hope of returning to friendly territory alive. As she prepared for the helicopter evacuation, Sarah reflected on how much she had changed during her time behind enemy lines. The terrified and isolated soldier who had escaped the canyon ambush had become a confident intelligence analyst and tactical planner. Her survival had required her to discover strengths she never knew she possessed. The rescue helicopter arrived exactly on schedule, its rotors beating a thunderous rhythm that echoed off the mountain walls surrounding the forward operating base. Sarah had been ready for hours, her few remaining possessions packed and her camera safely secured with the precious intelligence photos that had cost her teammates their lives. Captain Martinez walked with her to the landing zone, shouting over the rotor noise to give her final instructions. The flight back to her home base would take 90 minutes through some of the most dangerous airspace in Afghanistan. Enemy fighters were known to have shoulder-fired missiles that could bring down aircraft, so the helicopter would fly fast and low, following unpredictable routes through mountain valleys. As Sarah climbed aboard the helicopter, she looked back at the soldiers who had saved her life and given her a chance to contribute to their survival. These men had treated her, not as a victim to be pitied, but as a valuable team member whose skills and knowledge made them all stronger. The experience had taught her that survival wasn't just about enduring hardship, but about finding ways to help others even in the most desperate circumstances. The helicopter lifted off with a stomach-dropping lurch that reminded Sarah of carnival rides from her childhood. But this was no amusement park attraction. Through the small window, she could see tracer bullets rising from hidden positions as enemy fighters tried to shoot down the aircraft. The pilot responded with violent maneuvers that threw everyone around the cabin like ragdolls. During a brief moment of level flight, Sarah caught sight of the canyon where her teammates had died. From the air, the ambush site looked small and insignificant, just another rocky valley in an endless landscape of similar terrain. But she knew she would carry the memory of that place for the rest of her life, along with the faces of the 4 men who had not lived to see this rescue flight. The helicopter crew chief noticed her looking down at the canyon and moved closer to talk over the engine noise. He had been briefed about her story and wanted her to know that recovery teams had already retrieved her teammates' bodies for burial with full military honors. Captain Brooks, Sergeant Rodriguez, Corporal Williams, and Private Johnson would be going home to their families, even if they couldn't return alive. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and sadness at this news. She was glad that her friends wouldn't be left behind in enemy territory. But the reality of their deaths hit her again with fresh pain. She had survived when they didn't, and she would have to carry that burden along with her memories of their courage and sacrifice. The remainder of the flight passed without serious incident, though the helicopter continued taking evasive actions to avoid potential threats on the ground. Sarah tried to rest, but her mind kept racing as she thought about what would happen when she reached her home base. There would be debriefings, medical examinations, and probably psychological evaluations to determine if she was fit to continue serving. When the familiar buildings of her base appeared ahead, Sarah felt emotions she couldn't quite identify. Relief at being safe was mixed with anxiety about facing the questions and attention that would inevitably follow her return. She had become a different person during her time behind enemy lines, and she